Good evening, everyone. I want to thank everybody that has stuck around until the end. I know that everybody is tired and mentally fatigued at this point, so I'll try to be engaging and brief. At the outset, I want to note that I am not an expert, which will be my excuse if you ask questions that I don't know the answer to. But I'm hoping that my speech can open a topic of conversation that I think is very important, which I think people will have a lot of valuable input into, and that topic is the link between human trafficking and legalized prostitution. I think that in the context of especially human trafficking in the sexual context, I think we would be remiss to not discuss the critical link between human trafficking for sexual exploitation and legalized prostitution. So I'd like to examine that in some detail. I would like to point out, I think that there can be tension and it can seem like a logical inconsistency when you're discussing domestic legislation that countries are adopting in order to combat human trafficking, while at the same time acknowledging that many of these same countries have either legal sex industries or permitted sex industries. I think that there is a tension there that I would like to examine. So first, let's start with some of the rationale behind the idea of legalizing prostitution. I know that there's a feminist argument that women are autonomous and have the right to enter a life of sex work if they so choose. There's also the idea that regulation can help make the industry of prostitution and sex work safer for women in terms of disease prevention and also their personal safety from violence. I think there is a theory that regulation and legalization can reduce trafficking because domestic women with valid papers become more appealing to work in legalized and regulated markets. And I think these all have some logical value, and I think that it's easy to understand why people have wanted to explore this, but I'd like to examine a few case studies that I think illustrate why legalization is not effective and is critically linked with sexual exploitation and human trafficking. And I want to note at the outset that I'm naming names, but I don't want to appear that I'm being particularly hard on any specific countries. I just think that it's important to use specific case studies when you're analyzing the effectiveness of this legislation, and the fact is there's more data with respect to certain countries than there is to others. So when you talk about the legal and regulated sex industry, I think the country that first comes to mind for a lot of people is the Netherlands. So I'd like to look at that. The Netherlands lifted its ban on brothels in 2000. I think this was done in large part to legitimize the sex industry and make it safer for sex workers, but almost immediately problems became apparent. One study found that within a year of the lifting of the ban on brothels, 8 different Dutch victim support groups found an increase in the number of trafficking victims that were being reported to them. The former mayor of Amsterdam has a quote that I think is very telling. He said, quote, "We've realized this is no longer about small-scale entrepreneurs, but that big crime organizations are involved here in trafficking women, drugs, killings, and other criminal activity." Additionally, you saw the direct correlation between legalization and the increase in demand. There was actually a Dutch Ministry of Justice official who argued in favor of a legal quota on foreign sex workers because, quote, "the market demands a variety of bodies." I think it makes people uncomfortable to talk in those terms, but the fact is that when you are dealing with the legalized sex industry, you have to cater to buyers who want a variety of women. In 2007, in reaction to the infiltration and the expansion of the black market, despite efforts to the contrary, the government of the Netherlands actually shut down 1/3 of legal brothels in Amsterdam because of organized crime. In 2008, there was a study conducted by Dutch police that found that between 50 and 90% of women working in the prostitution industry were working involuntarily. I think another important case study that's been well documented is in Australia, where certain states have legalized prostitution, specifically Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. In Victoria, there are some estimates that women service 3.1 million buyers per year from an adult male population of only 1.3 million. So I think the statistics would indicate that it's becoming a destination. In New South Wales, other studies have indicated that illegal brothels are estimated to outnumber legal brothels by a proportion of 4 to 1, which illustrates the fact that even when you make it legal, the black market and organized crime is still motivated to operate in an illegal fashion. One study found that brothels in Victoria were earning approximately $1 million a week from illegal sex trafficking. And there's been well-documented cases of debt bondage where women were trafficked and then had their passports confiscated, which is something that we've discussed in detail and is a key facet of human trafficking. I think another issue that comes up with legalization is the normalization of sex work. And I think the argument goes that perhaps you have a segment of the population that would frequent a sex worker regardless of legality, but that you're going to have people that wouldn't have done it when it was illegal, but under the guise of legality, they start to equate that with morality and start to have qualms lifted. In Spain, where there's a large sex industry, there's some estimates that roughly 39% of the male Spanish population has frequented a sex worker at least once, which I think indicates a level of comfort with sex industry that is directly tied to legalization. So beyond those case studies, I think another thing that you have to look at is we have the issue of legalization tied to sex trafficking, but I think you also have to look at the human rights abuse that is prostitution in and of itself, even apart from connection to the sex industry. And I'm going to go through some statistics that I think are interesting, especially in the context of today, where earlier we heard so many statistics about the effects of sex trafficking on children. And you're going to see that a lot of these exact same problems are faced in women of prostitution. And these are not women who were trafficked, as far as we know, but these are just studies that were done on women in prostitution. A study performed by the Scientific Journal of Trauma Practice surveyed 854 prostituted women over a course of years, and this is what they found. 61% reported having been raped. 68% met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is roughly the same percentage as that found in combat veterans and victims of state-sponsored torture. 89% reported an urgent desire to escape prostitution. A study performed by the British Journal of Psychiatry found more than 50% of women in prostitution in the UK had also reported being raped, and 75% reported having been assaulted. A separate study found that women who worked in prostitution had the same incidence of traumatic brain injury as that found in torture survivors. The mortality rate of women in prostitution is 200 times higher than that of the general population. And a specific quote from that study is that no population of women previously studied had the percentage of deaths due to murder even approximating those found in the sample group of prostitutes. In the Netherlands, where it was legal, a study found that 60% of prostitutes working quote-unquote voluntarily reported physical assaults and 40% experienced sexual violence. I think it's also important to address the argument that regulation makes it safer. It's true that in many regulated markets, health checks and STD screenings occur, but I think it's important to note that this is done to protect the health of customers, not the health of the prostitutes. There's no health checks or STD screening necessary to become a patron of a prostitute, so they're still incurring the same amount of risk. Also, even where condoms are mandatory, it does not mean that either pimps or customers will demand sex without a condom, and this is especially true in the case of oral sex, where some studies have found that 90% of patrons expect that to be performed without a condom, even though this puts women at the same risk of STD and other sexually transmitted diseases as unprotected sex. So taking all of this into account, I think it's the question then becomes, why is there not a stronger response on the part of state actors tying legalized sex with the illicit trafficking of women for the purposes of prostitution? And to that end, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the US response, because I think the US has been extremely vocal, as Professor Archer noted yesterday, in taking a position against the legalized sex industry. But that even within the US position, I think there is some ambiguity that I think is important to address, and I think that it helps illustrate the complexity of the issue and the amount of factors involved. I want to start with a quote, and this was from the 2008 Trafficking in Persons report that I think sums up the issue that I'm describing very well. Sex trafficking would not exist without the demand for commercial sex flourishing around the world. Prostitution and related activities, including pimping and patronizing or maintaining brothels, encourage the growth of modern-day slavery by providing a facade behind which traffickers for sexual exploitation operate. Where prostitution is tolerated, there is a greater demand for human trafficking victims, and nearly always an increase in the number of women and children trafficked into commercial sex slavery. Few women seek out or choose to be in prostitution, and most are desperate to leave it. A 2003 scientific study in the Journal of Trauma Practice found that 89% of women in prostitution want to escape prostitution, but had no other options for survival. This is consistent with the US policy on several fronts. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, there are, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which I'm going to call the TVPA, restricts anti-trafficking funds to groups that oppose prostitution. As amended in 2013, it authorizes federal agencies and departments to terminate grants, contracts, and agreements if the grantee engages in the procurement of a commercial sex act while the contract is in effect. A separate act, which was the HIV, Tuberculosis, and Malaria Act of 2003, also required agencies who desired government funding to oppose prostitution and sex trafficking. All of these indicate that the US has taken a strong public position against the legalized sex industry, which I commend. But in analyzing the TVPA more closely, I think that there is some ambiguity. I know that a lot of people have familiarity with the TVPA, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but I do want to describe it in broad strokes. The TVPA was implemented in 2000, and broadly speaking, it's the US's government response to trafficking, both domestically and internationally. It's been extremely effective and has had broad-reaching appeal, especially as I emphasize in the international approach. The TVPA prohibits, quote, severe forms of trafficking in persons, which the act defines as sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. Under the TVPA, the US evaluates virtually every country in the globe on an annual basis to determine if the country complies with minimum standards. The minimum standard I want to focus on for purposes of this is that the government of the country should make serious and sustained efforts to eliminate severe forms of trafficking in persons. And in determining whether or not this fourth standard has been met, there's a laundry list of 11 different criteria that the US can look to. But in 2008, a new factor was added in a reauthorization, which states that the US will evaluate whether the government of the country has made serious and sustained efforts to reduce the demand for commercial sex acts and participation in international sex tourism by nationals of the country. Where, depending on how the US evaluates your compliance with the minimum standards, you're placed on one of 4 tiers. Tier 1 is full compliance, Tier 2 is making significant efforts to comply, there's also a Tier 2 watch list, and Tier 3 signifies that there's no compliance or no significant efforts to comply. Tier 3 countries are at risk of losing all non-humanitarian, non-trade related aid. So I think that based on the US position as I've described, and also the fact that under the TVPA we're to examine whether or not the country is making significant efforts to reduce the demand for commercial sex, one could assume that the US would penalize those countries with large, regulated commercial sex industries that seem to have sort of indisputably be tied up with creating demand for sex workers, but that has not been the case. I think there's numerous factors for that, but I think it's worth analyzing why countries like the Netherlands and Germany and others with huge domestic sex markets still find themselves in Tier 1, which indicates that they have maintained full compliance with the minimum standards of the Act. And I certainly don't want to just point at the US, although I think analyzing that legislation is helpful, but I think you see that across the board with state actors, a reluctance to come down too harshly on countries with regulated sex markets, and I think a lot of that is tied up with just the limits of diplomacy and the fact that it's uncomfortable to criticize allies and the way that they handle this. And also, I think that it's fair to say that it's a complicated issue, which there are many different divergent viewpoints, which leads me to where we are today, where we are coming up with recommendations for how the Vatican could address this problem. And I think there's a number of ideas. One that I personally support, and I think a number of people support, is what's called the Nordic model, which is where prostitution is illegal in a country, but it's not illegal for the prostitute, it's illegal for the buyer of sex. And this helps alleviate some of the problems that you see when a country illegalizes prostitution and then uses that as an opportunity to arrest women working in the sex industry while letting Johns go free. I think a larger, more nebulous, more interesting idea, which I can't say that I have fully figured out the parameters of, but I think it's one worthy of discussion, is addressing the male demand for prostitution. There would be no sex industry if there were not a desire for men to purchase prostitutes. And I think that that's a very fundamental aspect that needs to be addressed. I think that there's a school of thought that it's misogyny and a hatred of women that leads them to see them in an objective way. Personally, I feel like it's more complicated than that. I think that the problem truly, in a way, is that not necessarily that an inequality of women as a whole, but the fact that in many sectors, I don't believe that sex workers are even viewed fully as women or as people, but as something other that is deserving of less rights than, say, your sister or your mother or your wife, that they're not perceived as part of the human condition, which I think is something that the Vatican, with its ability to discuss moral issues freely, is in a very good position to address. And I think that Pope Benedict did a very good job of addressing that when he talked about the fact that prostitution is troubling and the pornographic industry is troubling to the extent that it indicates that women are lesser. So, in conclusion, it's a complicated issue. Just glancing over the proposals that were just handed out, I see that we have incorporated in the draft, it looks like, the Swedish model, which I think is encouraging. I also would love the discussion to address what we can do to eliminate the demand of prostitution and to make men more aware of the horrors that are inflicted upon women who work in the sex industry and that is being perpetrated by patrons of the sex industry, whether personally by them or not. Thank you.